After 15 videos and 6 hours of breakdowns, we've arrived at the fruitless endeavor of ranking these players. Before we hit the countdown, there are a few things to sort out. First, I considered a handful of active players as candidates for this series, but they still may be peaking. There are a number of videos on this channel about them already if you're interested. There were also older players who didn't quite make the cut, and for some of you, these players will be in your personal top 10s. Many of them will hopefully be featured in a future series, but the best of the rest for me were probably Dwayne Wade and Dirk Nowitzki. Next, remember the criteria for this series. We're only interested in on-court impact that increases a team's odds of winning a championship. There are also no time machines. This is about a player's impact in his time relative to the league. A peak must have multiple seasons, so players with single-year spikes will be slightly lower than if this were a list of one-year peaks. And finally, this list only includes stars after the ABA merger in 1977, and the simple reason for this is confidence. We don't have the same data quality going far back in time, and we have a considerable shortage of film in the 60s and even the early 70s to work with, so our confidence intervals back then are much wider. Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, Jerry West, and Oscar Robertson would all be strong top 10 candidates if we went back to the shot clock, but there's a bit too much uncertainty to give them the same level of depth as these post-merger stars. And uncertainty will be a theme on this list. I'll emphasize ranges as usual, but the size of those ranges will be larger than normal because these players are so good that a 5% confidence interval makes a bigger difference than with typical all-NBA level players. And in a way, that's one of my biggest takeaways from this series. There's only so much we can reasonably differentiate between players of this quality with the tools we currently have. With that said, here's my best effort to sort out the best of the best. If I held everyone else on this list constant and used an optimistic evaluation, Bill Walton could go as high as 10th, while either Kevin Durant or Kobe Bryant could be up at 8th. But for me, the number 10 slot goes to Magic Johnson. Magic is a candidate for the best offensive player in history because he relentlessly hunted for high-end shots with his own scoring or passing. This concept is discussed in Thinking Basketball, the book, in more detail, and we also have decades of plus-minus data showing us that volume playmaking is incredibly valuable. Remember, the Lakers' offense torched opponents during Magic's peak, but these were also gifted offensive rosters. Without Irvin from 1986 to 89, the Lakers were still 2.4 points ahead of league average in 29 games, and some of those games were played without the secondary playmaking of Michael Cooper. I also think we underestimate just how skilled Magic was as a scorer. Looking at his adjusted playoff scoring by series, we see times where he ramped up his own volume with great success. Those numbers inside the circles are his team's offensive efficiency, so a plus 14 means the Lakers' offensive rating was 14 points better than their opponent's regular season defense, a fantastic number. As a central offensive hub, I view Magic as one of the 3 best decision makers in league history, and that's reflected in his box score, where he looks like one of the best offensive players ever. A minor downside is that he needs the ball to exert that value, so he paired best with finishers and great quick-hitting post players. But the much bigger issue in this conversation is his defense. He often guarded bigger, lesser skilled players, while smaller, more skilled defenders like Cooper or Byron Scott took the opposing lead guard. More importantly, he just wasn't much of a paint presence despite his size, usually playing one of the forward positions on defense, so I see Johnson as a neutral defender during these seasons, and even a negative by the end of the 80s. My low-end evaluation would drop him behind everyone else in this series, but his high-end estimation would take him all the way to 5th. While Magic was a one-way superstar, we saw the impact of two-way bigs throughout this series. Walton's defense and high-post offense led to a dominant 2-year stretch during an era of parity, And stars like Anthony Davis, Kevin Garnett, Tim Duncan, David Robinson, Dave Cowens, and Wilt Chamberlain have all racked up championships playing this defensive number 1, offensive number 2 role. You know who else played that role? Scottie Pippen. These aforementioned players have starred on 13 championship teams since the merger, 16 if we include an even weaker offensive player like Draymond Green, 18 if we include a slightly weaker defender like mid-80s Kevin McHale, and then there are lighter versions of this archetype like Rasheed Wallace and even late career Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Depending on where we draw the lines, about half of the titles since the ABA merger have featured one of these defensive stars who is also a big offensive contributor. By comparison, a little more than 2/3 of all post-merger championships have been led by clear-cut offensive superstars like Magic or Kobe, which leads us to the case study for building around this archetype, Tim Duncan. Alongside quality teammates, Duncan made the Spurs a title contender in basically every season he was healthy during his prime. His one-number metrics in the playoffs are even better than Magic's, although I do think there's some noise to sift through there. His surrounding years look drastically different, despite being a fairly similar player. Compare that to someone like Garnett, whose postseason numbers throughout his prime consistently echoed his historically strong regular season plus-minus results. KG's tricky to evaluate because he only played a few dozen games in Minnesota, and because scoring was his weakest attribute. He was just entering his prime as a scorer in 2003 before leveling up again in 2004, which leaves us with 4 playoff series to analyze, and half of those games were against the Lakers, a team statistically underrated by their regular season defense, and a team Garnett struggled with in general. Despite being a slightly weaker scorer in Boston, his playoff numbers in 2008 were better when he was the leading postseason scorer on a good but not great championship offense. With small samples like this, we can also look to the regular season for clues, where Garnett's adjusted scoring numbers against stronger defenses looked almost identical to Duncan's during their best scoring years. Timmy did beat up on weaker defenses in a way Garnett never did, and I think that reflects a slight isolation scoring edge for Duncan. He was able to pressure the rim with his strength and low post game. Duncan's playoff scoring during their peaks was a clear rung above what Garnett ever reached, but Garnett's also pretty clearly a better passer to me, which gives him a minor playmaking edge. Ultimately, neither of these players is driving a world-class offense by themselves. They need to be paired with another heavy lifter or two, and that's where Garnett's extra passing, outside shooting, and quick-hitting attack makes up some value, despite Duncan's edge in isolation scoring. On defense, I used to actually prefer Timmy's rim protection for that era because his team's defenses were so good, but I think it's pretty clear now that these Spurs were an elite defensive team without Duncan. He and KG actually saw similar changes in some of these defensive metrics. For instance, Minnesota couldn't protect the paint like San Antonio, but the degree of improvement in paint defense with Garnett on the court was comparable to Duncan's. And KG has the best defensive awareness of any player I've ever studied in a considerable sample. That's enough for me to give him a small edge on defense, and I value his passing and outside shooting next to better and better teammates. If that's not crazy enough for you yet, at number 7 is the controversial Steph Curry. And yes, Curry also has an argument for as high as number 3 on this list if viewed optimistically. These players are all just so ridiculously good and hard to clearly separate. Like Magic, Steph is basically providing one-way impact, but I slightly prefer his offensive package, maybe. If we look at his adjusted plus-minus over 3-year periods, Steph looks like an outlier in offensive impact. Now, One limitation with this stat is that it's hard to untangle it from a player's role on his team, in this case Steve Kerr's offense, which is why a compelling data point for me is how good Curry was from 2013 to 15, which includes 2 years of Mark Jackson coaching him, and it's before he ramped up his aggression to 11 in 2016. My bigger question with Steph is whether that impact holds in the playoffs, and as we saw during his episode, I'd say it loses a little bite, but the general signal as an outlying offensive force remains. From 2016 to 2019, the Warriors outscored playoff opponents by 10 points per 48 minutes with Curry on the court, and that was a 15-point improvement from when he sat in those games, almost all of which came on the offensive end. It's also apparent to me that Curry isn't some clear negative on defense. My concern there is durability related. First, could he stay healthy? And then second, how much could teams wear down his offense by targeting him on the other end and away from the ball? That tactic seemed to have some success, but opponents who sold out to take away his scoring still paid a gravity tax, and since the box score can't capture that well, it makes it look like his impact declined more than it probably did. At number 6, I start to get a little more comfortable with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. There's certainly less uncertainty for me with Cap. I wouldn't drop him below 10th, although I'm a little lower on his high end than some of the surrounding players, so he lands here. Remember, this is strictly late 70s Kareem, so including a few of the prior years might even bump him up for me. He was clearly a strong rim protector, but there were also lulls in his defensive awareness. I see him well below Walton as a paint protector, but pinpointing Kareem's exact defensive impact is tricky, and minor changes would move him up a few spots on a list like this. Another challenge is gauging his offensive impact without a three-point line. More modern post players can spruce up their shot creation by kicking it out to shooters for three, but Abdul-Jabbar didn't have that luxury. He had some post gravity and he could pass too, but it was really his crazy scoring that powered most of his value. We've talked about resiliency in this series, and that sky hook was just about as resilient as it gets. You can see from his series-by-series results that it was almost impossible to take away his individual scoring, but I don't think he had the playmaking to crack the inner circle of modern offensive legends. So while he's an incredible post anchor for the time, I'm not confident he has one of the 3 or 4 best peaks since the merger. At number 5, I have Larry Bird, who could go all the way back to 13th using a low-end perspective, and yes, broken record time could go all the way up to 3rd when viewed optimistically. Unlike Kareem, Bird's volume scoring is his biggest question mark in an otherwise transcendent offensive package. We know his scoring declined in the playoffs and against strong defenses, but this was still dangerous scoring among closer examination. From 1984 to 87, his adjusted playoff numbers were good, but a step down in volume compared to the best of the best. In the regular season, his scoring rate fell off against the athletic Lakers defense, but there's also reason to believe he was worn down by huge minutes in the playoffs, and that infamous bar fight in the 1985 Eastern Finals might have hampered his scoring that year too. Without Kevin McHale in the mid-80s, Bird did ramp up his volume by a few points, so I do think he traded in some of his own scoring to set up skilled teammates. And most importantly, that scoring still demanded defensive attention that kept Boston's offense at elite levels. Since we know playmaking is a huge driver of offensive impact, I think Bird's incredible passing, movement, shooting, split-second decision-making, and propensity for finding layups made him an all-time level playmaker. Like Curry, that spacing, movement, and even gravity aren't easily detectable in a stat sheet, but they do help the team's offense perform at amazing levels. For example, in 1989, Boston played 40 games with their same starting lineup from the year before, only with Reggie Lewis replacing an injured Bird. That team played slightly over 500 ball and posted a strong offensive rating relative to the league. But when the Celtics had that starting lineup together in '88, they were nearly 6 points better on offense, posting a whopping plus 9.6 offensive rating. And while it's only a single piece of information, it represents the kind of ceiling raising I think Bird had without all-time level scoring. On defense, he was a playmaker with great hands and some rim protection, and was often early in paint rotations. He was certainly limited as a perimeter defender, but that's still a good positive package, which is essentially the difference compared to Magic here, peak for peak. Much like positions 5 through 8 on this list, I could flip a coin between 3rd and 4th. Let's start with Hakeem Olajuwon, whose defense moves the needle so much that it's hard for me to have him lower than 10th. Perhaps nothing reinforces the crazy value of rim protection back in the 90s, like Hakeem averaging nearly 5 blocks per game in the 1993 playoffs because the three-point line wasn't popular yet. We have plus-minus studies reaching back into the 90s, slightly after Olajuwon's peak, and rim protectors display some massive defensive value. In the 21st century, the game's best offensive players have reached greater heights than the game's best defensive players, but defensive superstars aren't that far behind. While each individual player has some uncertainty in these studies, the presence of so many dominant rim protectors at the top makes it likely that Olajuwon was in a similar ballpark in terms of value in the mid-90s. I actually find Hakeem's offensive impact to be a bit fuzzier. He was clearly a great isolation scorer who gave teams a solid floor in the playoffs, but he also never played on a really good regular season offense, so we couldn't see him blend his game with another big-time star. His best offensive teammate was Clyde Drexler in 1995, and in 26 games they posted a healthy offensive rating before an even hotter stretch in their championship run. Playing inside out off of Hakeem's post scoring was clearly the way to build around him, and it's tempting to view their successful playoff offense with that shorter three-point line as proof that he's a heliocentric superstar. But some of those lineups were offensively slanted and, more importantly, had more viable shooters than most teams could expect at that point, especially with Robert Horry reining in threes as a stretch power forward. I tend to view Olajuwon as the best of the two-way big men, a solid offensive centerpiece with the right offensive talent around him, but someone otherwise limited by his playmaking, preventing him from cracking the top 2 on this list. Shaq, on the other hand, was a true all-timer on offense. He was also aided by three-point shooting teammates, but O'Neal separated himself in a few ways from basically every offensive center in the first 65 years of the shot clock. His off-ball presence, constantly working for dangerous paint catches, allowed him to fit next to perimeter stars without monopolizing the ball, and he was also a solid passer, so he could hit those shooters and cutters too. If we return to that 4-year plus-minus graphic in the playoffs, Shaq barely missed qualifying because he only sat for 448 minutes, but his impact looks enormous, and unlike most big men, that impact is primarily on offense. Ironically, it's defense that keeps the diesel down for me. The Lakers surrounded him with a ton of 3-and-D players, and even though Shaq had success as a rim protector, his lack of mobility and engagement clearly limited his defensive punch relative to his size. In a number of series over the years, teams successfully attacked O'Neal in pick and roll, and stretch big men could give him problems as well. Most impact metrics view his regular season defense as good, but a clear rung or so below the great defensive big men. And that defensive plus-minus might be inflated because opposing coaches played so many unskilled bigs just to bang with Shaq and eat up fouls. Still, of all the players we've discussed so far, my high-end evaluation of Shaq would take him above everyone else, although there is still some separation between him and the top 2 players on this list, Michael Jordan and LeBron James. Before this series, I thought Michael had some space between him and LeBron, but I'm not so sure anymore. Then again, I'm more confident in MJ's floor as a player. My low-end range would take him just a hair behind Shaq's high-end evaluation, whereas James has more question marks for me that take his low-end estimation down a bit more. If I were building a team with role players who could shoot and defend, I'd probably take LeBron. He's one of the 3 best decision makers of the three-point era, giving the entire offense a resiliency. When you take away his scoring, he punishes you with playmaking. And yes, I do think peak LeBron was a better defender than this version of MJ, and this two-way impact makes James the greatest floor raiser ever in my book. On the other hand, LeBron matured more as a passer in later years, whereas Jordan pretty much lined up everything from 1989 to 1991. Those were his best passing and his best scoring years, while his defense and motor were still elite. As we saw, Michael has a really strong case for the best scorer in league history, and that relentless pressure turned MJ into one of history's greatest playmakers. His shot creation estimates are higher than LeBron's were in his best 3 Miami seasons, even when Wade went to the bench. Then again, LeBron's scoring doesn't seem that far behind Jordan's. He didn't match Michael's overall volume, but remember when Wade sat, LeBron cranked his volume up to MJ levels, and the overall Heat offense was dominant. That whole LeBron ball thing we discussed was pretty good.
Pretty good.
I have both of them as top 10 scorers and playmakers ever during these peaks, and both led high-end playoff offenses, although Jordan's teams weren't as efficient as LeBron's until Pippen and the rest of the roster rounded into form. It was probably impossible to surround a superstar with specialists in the 80s and reach the offensive height that LeBron ball generated with competent three-point shooters. And that matters here since this is all about impact relative to era. We only have league-wide plus-minus data in the playoffs since 1997, but Jordan's 3-year peak was up with the modern titans of this stat, and in a more stable metric like augmented plus-minus, MJ would rank second among all players on record. Of course, LeBron's best stretch is third all-time, only that came in his first Cleveland stint, and the fourth best stretch also belongs to LeBron from his second Cleveland stint. These results are all close enough that we can't really distinguish between them in a stat like this, but LeBron's Miami peak was a step lower because, as we've mentioned, letting Wade drive the offense at times took away some of LeBron's on-ball value. It's a similar story in box-only metrics, where Jordan has some separation from LeBron's MVP seasons in Cleveland and a slightly larger edge against him in Miami. Ultimately, I think team construction makes a big difference when choosing between these peaks. LeBron ball works with 3-and-D rosters and stretch big men, but it's also a slower, more tactical approach that doesn't fit as well next to other ball-dominant players. So if I'm forced to choose, and I don't really want to, I'd give the number one multi-year peak to Michael Jordan. Essentially because I think he fits on more teams, while LeBron really has to be the engine with spacers around him to exert that mega value. Now, I'm only one person, so Thinking Basketball subscribers on Patreon helped out by submitting their rankings after the series for a wisdom of crowds perspective. The voters also had a clear top 10 with a slightly different order. Duncan and Garnett first, but Garnett was far more polarizing. He was in the top 5 on 15% of ballots versus Duncan's 10%, but KG was left off of nearly a quarter ballots entirely, with Kobe replacing him on about 2/3 of those lists. Bird and Magic went next, and then the series' most polarizing player, Steph Curry. Curry finished third in first place votes, while also finishing 8th in top 8 votes. Hakeem and Kareem were in a virtual tie, with Abdul-Jabbar grabbing about twice as many top 3 spots as Olajuwon. Well, Shaq was a clear number 3, placing second or third on nearly half the ballots. And for the number 1 spot, 59% of voters went with Michael Jordan, enough to edge out LeBron James and his 32% of the first place votes. So, after 16 videos, 14 players, and 5 glorious decades of NBA history, this has been the greatest peaks. Thank you so much for all of your support during this series. I really hope you found this final episode thought-provoking. If you're wondering where to find old games, USA Sports on DVD was a huge source for this series, with thousands of games going back to the 70s. A big thanks to Crumpled Jumper for providing the player art, the YouTube channel 70s Fan for collecting classic footage featured in this series, and a very special thanks to Cody Hodek for helping scout games, along with our incredible video coordinator, Mike De La Rosa. To support this channel, you can sign up at patreon.com/thinkingbasketball and join our Discord community, get access to the stats used throughout this series, and more. I'll also link the most relevant episodes of the Thinking Basketball podcast below in the description box. That is it for this series, so until the next one, wherever you are out there in the world, I hope that you're having a great day.